Well, say your prayers, little one, to forget my son, to include everyone. For dreams of war, dreams of lies, dreams of dragons fire, a land of things that will bade.
Hey, what's up, everyone? Today I'm going to rank all of Metallica's studio albums, but first I want to talk about The Office. The Office is credited with bringing cringe humor to the forefront, but I'd argue that that is only true if you've never seen Metallica's Some Kind of Monster. Metallica's Some Kind of Monster is the cringiest thing ever put on video. And if we take a look at the numbers, The Office debuted March 24th, 2005, and Some Kind of Monster debuted January 4th, 2004. So I think it's safe to say that The Office, the US version, was not based off of anything else except for a documentary about a metal band called Some Kind of Monster. And from watching Some Kind of Monster, we can get the idea that at this point in time, Metallica was sort of in disarray. They had hired a band psychiatrist or psychologist, this Twink Lettitz guy, and he was giving out banana stickers, telling them to zone it. And they were saying, that sounds stock. And they were basically making fools out of themselves. And at the time, my buddy Jamie, who's a great songwriter, and I'll link to his YouTube channel in the description, but he said they don't need to hire a psychologist. They could hire me and I'd tell them what they need to do. They need to play fast. So at this time, it seemed like Metallica was obsessed with the sales numbers and forgetting to play fast, forgetting to play speed metal as a speed metal band. And so in this analysis of Metallica's albums, I'd like to look at three criteria: my own personal rating, the sales figures for all of their albums, and the average beats per minute for all of their albums. And I found the beats per minute by taking the beats per minute of each track from the site Get Song BPM, which is a fantastic site. And if you're ever looking for song BPMs, it's a place to go. And then the sales figures in terms of total of units sold, which I got from a site called statisticsbrain.com. And in terms of my own personal rating, what I did was I listened to one album by Metallica a day for 10 straight days, which is over 11 hours of Metallica. So I'm thoroughly Metallica saturated, but I've been able to use that time to sort of forge a ranking of my favorite Metallica songs. And if we think about Some Kind of Monster, that was made while they were making the album Saint Anger, and many people feel like Saint Anger is their worst album. But I'm going to start with number 10, what I feel like is their worst album. And there's no way that Saint Anger's their worst album in a world where Load exists. I mean, load of crap, am I right? Load was the only record that I listened to that I really wanted to shut off halfway through. All the other Metallica albums were totally listenable. But Load, yikes, it was, I guess the best way I could describe it is it was totally cheese dick. So if we take a look at the numbers, my personal rating for Load was 10th out of 10. It's the 10th best and or the worst Metallica album. Now, in terms of sales, though, it's ranked third all time with 8.5 million units sold. It's octuple platinum. So if you ever have the displeasure of throwing Load on your headphones, just remember, it's sold more albums than you'll ever sell in your lifetime. And in terms of speed, the BPM, the average BPM for the album is 113.23 beats per minute, making it the 9th or second slowest album out of all of them. So this sort of supports the theory that they needed to play fast. Load was really the album that turned people against Metallica. I think after the Black Album, the commercial success of the Black Album, everyone was waiting for the follow-up. And when they came out with Load, they were like, yikes, this sucks. And it wasn't just that they cut their hair. It's that the songs were no good, and it was super cheesy, and it was much slower than you were expecting. And it's just a bad album altogether. And that brings us to number 9, my second least favorite and or 9th most favorite Metallica album, Reload. Reload the crap, am I right? So yeah, I have this ranked 9th. And in terms of sales, it is 6th all time. So unlike Load, I think that people felt like they got duped by Load and fewer people bought Reload. But Reload is, in my opinion, more of the same as with Load, but just a better album than Load. Load is terrible. It's hard to listen to because it's so damn cheesy. At least Reload has a few moments of levity, of not being the worst Metallica ever. And in terms of speed, it is 8th. So third to last at 118.46 beats per minute. And let's go on to album number 8. The number 8 Metallica album, as far as I'm concerned, is the Black Album. The Black Album, my personal rating, I kind of put it in a similar place as Load and Reload. I just don't like middle period hard rock Metallica. That never resonated with me. And I think that one of the problems with Metallica, who I was never a huge fan of, was that I'm not old enough to remember them when they were cool, but I am old enough to remember them when they were not cool. And I feel like 1991, when the Black Album came out, that was my first exposure to them, and that was sort of the beginning of the end. They'd stopped playing thrash metal, they'd stopped playing speed metal, and of course, the Black Album is better than Load and Reload, and it was tough to put some of those newer albums ahead of this one, but I just like the style on some of the newer albums more than the Black Album. Now, the production on the Black Album is second to none, and in terms of its sales, it is head and shoulders above every other Metallica album, with more than double the sales of the second-ranked album in terms of sales. Now, in terms of speed, it is the slowest Metallica album, and I think that's what the fans were upset about. With speed metal, you really should be playing fast, and the Black Album turned their back on that paradigm, and I think that people felt somewhat betrayed because of it. So we're going to move on to number 7. We have that middle period 90s Metallica totally taken care of with our first 3, and we're moving on to number 7, which is the brand new Metallica album, Hardwired to Self-Destruct. What can I say about this album except for that it's not really all that memorable? The Black Album is more memorable, but they were playing fast and it sounded like they were having fun, and I enjoyed it. I listened to it and it reminded me of an old school Metallica album. Cheesy, but all Metallica's kind of cheesy. So I ranked this 7th. Its sales ranked is lowest, but you have to remember that this has only been out for like a year or 2 years. A year at the time when I collected the sales figures. And so it's had less time to garner sales over its life. And I think people buy fewer albums now. They have some sort of algorithm that incorporates streaming into total sales. But the day of the metal album or the rock album altogether and selling millions and millions of copies is all but over. But in terms of total BPM, this one ranks 5th. It's right there in the middle, and I think it's a return to form in terms of playing thrash, although they returned to form a little bit earlier than this. But this is sort of old school Metallica, their first album in 8 years since they'd released Death Magnetic. And it's pretty good. It's listenable for sure. It's thrashy, it's fast, and it's cheesy. It's everything you think of when you think of Metallica. So we're going to move on to number 6. And this is, I think, one of my most controversial is putting Saint Anger at number 6. And people will say, Saint Anger, that one sounds bad. And the rap against Saint Anger is that the snare drum sounds horrible, the drums sound horrible, the whole album sounds grimy, and there are no guitar solos. And I'd have to say, yeah, that's true. But after listening to Load and Reload, because as I said, I listened to all these albums in chronological order, Saint Anger was a breath of fresh air. There were some songs that I remember, you're living a lie, man, you're living a lie, man. And yeah, there were no guitar solos, but after the Black Album, Load and Reload, you're just tired of hearing Kurt Hammett just lean on that wah pedal over and over again. This album, I applaud it for being different. And it sounds different. And after I listened to all the albums, I sort of did some research. And what was astonishing to me was the amount of work they put into this album. Yeah, I'd seen Some Kind of Monster, but they'd basically recorded for months and months and months and months. And this is what is coming out of the speakers. Because it doesn't sound good. It doesn't sound pretty. The drums are the worst sounding drums on any Metallica album. But hey, it's fast, it's aggressive. There's, anger and issues being dealt with. And it's entertaining. I found it far more entertaining than any of that mid-period crap. So let's move on to number 5. And I think this is another controversial one because I'm putting Saint Anger and Hardwired to Self-Destruct and Death Magnetic above the Black Album, and people will say, how could you possibly do that? Well, Death Magnetic is fast, it's furious, and it's in your face. I think that this was produced by Rick Rubin, of all people, and I'm a Rick Rubin fan. I think that he does a lot of cool stuff. And the knock on this album, which is also a true knock, sort of like with the snare drum and the production on Saint Anger, is that this is just overcompressed. And yes, it's overcompressed, but it's loud, it's in your face, and some of the riffage is pretty darn cool. Some of the coolest stuff we've heard since early Metallica, which, if you haven't guessed yet, is the top four, as the first four Metallica albums are all the top four. But I ranked Death Magnetic fifth because for the first time in several days, after listening to the albums in chronological order from release, this album actually resonated with me as I could listen to this again. And believe it or not, it's the third fastest Metallica album. They wanted to, I think, start playing thrash again. And despite the fact that this is one of the lowest selling, again, for the same reasons that Hardwired is one of the lowest selling, because it's a new era and people don't buy records anymore, and Metallica has really passed their prime in terms of a sales engine for rock and roll, even though I think Hardwired to Self-Destruct had the most sales out of any album in the year that it was released. But even though the sales are low, the speed is high, and that's why I ranked Death Magnetic so highly. So let's get to the final four, and I think it's no surprise that Metallica's first four albums are in my top four. The number four album for me is their second album, Ride the Lightning, and a lot of people really, really love this album. It's the fifth highest selling album and the fourth fastest album, but I rank it fourth just because the other three albums have more memorable tracks, as far as I'm concerned. And Justice for All's got great tracks, and everything else that's going to be in the top three has great tracks that I remember more than the songs that are on Ride the Lightning. Now, it did pretty well in sales. It's fifth all time, and in speed, it's fourth all time. So as we can see, this is the classic era Metallica thrash, where they're just playing speed metal, they're writing sick songs, and they're just busting it out. And moving on to number three, we have And Justice for All, the first album they did without Cliff Burton, their fourth album. And the knock against this is that you can't hear any bass. And that doesn't really bother me too much. I don't feel like thrash metal is a genre where bass shines too much. I love the songs, and I remember the video for One as a kid and thinking, wow, this one song is so much better than Enter Sandman and Unforgiven and all the stuff on the Black Album. Come to find out, I had the same opinions back then as I do now about the thrash metal early days. But what's surprising about And Justice for All, which is their second highest selling album, thank goodness that And Justice for All has sold more than Load, because if Load was the second highest selling album, wow, it would be an unfair world. But the surprising thing about And Justice for All is that it's near the bottom in terms of how fast it is, at 118.55 beats per minute average. And that's kind of a shocker, because you think of this as classic Metallica, speed metal Metallica. But even as early as And Justice for All, they were slowing down the pace on things, doing longer songs that were more of a slog and less of an in-your-face speed metal extravaganza. But nonetheless, And Justice for All has great songs, and it's ranked third. So we're moving on to number two, and for number two, I have Metallica's debut, Kill 'Em All. Kill 'Em All is awesome. Some of the songs are awesome. There's so much great energy, and it is the fastest Metallica album. First at 158 beats per minute on average. Jump in the Fire, Whiplash, everything on this album is just so energetic, so fun to listen to, catchy, and that's why it's number two. Now, in terms of sales, it's below a lot of their albums. It's below Load. It's below the other classics from the early years. It's definitely below the Black Album, which is number one. But that doesn't really matter to me. As a debut, I think it's one of the greatest metal debuts of all time, and it's one of Metallica's best albums. And we're moving on to number one. No surprise here. Master of Puppets. Master of Puppets is an awesome album, and I think it's Metallica at their greatest. They still had Cliff Burton, and they were writing these songs, whereas Kill 'Em All was thrash, but sort of Motorhead inspired. We sort of saw Metallica come into their own with these sort of diverse compositions and playing fast, but adding in musical segments, bridges, codas, doing everything right. And so My personal rating is number 1 for this. In terms of sales, it's the 4th of all time. And in terms of speed, it's second behind Kill 'Em All, the second fastest Metallica album. So we've gotten to the top. You've seen my top 10. How do the ratings for me correlate with the ratings for total sales and the ratings for total speed? Well, I put all this into Excel and I got my Spearman correlations, and my ratings correlated to sales came out to a correlation coefficient of negative 0.042. And if you don't know what a correlation coefficient is, it's a number between 1 and negative 1. Negative 1 would be absolute inverse correlation. Positive 1 would be absolute correlation. So at near 0, or 4/10, or 4/100ths, my ratings to sales were relatively uncorrelated. There was no correlation between what I rated things and what the total sales ended up being. Now, my ratings to speed were 0.8, which is so close to 1 that they were highly correlated. And I didn't take the time to do a test of hypothesis to get significance values, but I think that my rating to sales is insignificant, but my ratings to speed is very significant. But perhaps the more telling statistic is the correlation between sales and speed. There's a negative correlation. The faster the albums are, the more poorly they sold. So can you really blame Metallica for slowing things down in the middle part of their career while they were selling albums? While for every time they dipped the BPM, they earned millions of more dollars? It would be tough to not play slower. And for those of you who are struggling with this correlation numbers, here's a dope chart that I've made. The orange is sales, and the blue is my ratings, and the gray is speed. And that's the end of the video, folks. So I hope you've enjoyed my whirlwind tour of the top 10 Metallica albums. Let me know in the comments if you feel differently, if you think I've screwed up, if you think that saying the newer albums are better than the Black Album is heresy, or if you think that rating Anger 6 is madness. I really want to know. So take care of yourselves, everyone. Have a great day, and keep on listening to music. Peace.
Well, say your prayers, little one, to forget my son, to include everyone. For dreams of war, dreams of lies, dreams of dragons fire, a land of things that will bade.